Okay, so I'm going to check this and make sure that it is actually working, since it's been having lots and lots and lots of issues. This has happened literally every day that I've tried to do this. There we go, it's working. Okay, so. All right, so we need to talk about ethics and corporate social responsibility. And then next week, what I'll do is the class won't meet. You will have that time to work on, you'll have class time to work on the exam, which will include a rather lengthy essay. So I do want to talk about the essay for just a second. If you go to D2L, and in D2L, you go to your marketing ethics course, and then you go to content, and then orientation. There should be down at the bottom something called case 21. If you click on that, it gives you a case study from a textbook that I wrote that involves a newspaper and advertising in a school, university newspaper. And then if you go back to that orientation module after you've read that, and then look at the sample essay, that will give you what is a C-level response to an essay for this exercise that you're going to do next week. What would an A-level response? So this is basically a 5-paragraph essay. You need to cite sources that you use in the essay. You can do that in text. So probably the easiest way to do it is to type your essay up in Word and then copy and paste it into the prompt on D2L. And that will let you do it. You should be able to leave the exam open. And if you don't submit it, go in and out. And so you can submit the essay through D2L. So next week, we won't have class. You'll have class time to work on that. Does that make sense? So we're going to finish talking about corporate social responsibility. So look at that. And that's a C-level response to a prompt or a fact pattern that you would face, as a marketer in real life, right? It's supposed to be like a fairly realistic fact pattern. So all of the exams will have this. You need to, again, cite sources. What would an A-level answer be? I have students ask that it's like, well, if this is a C, can you give me an example of an A? No, like this, I can't write the essay for you, right? I mean, you have to think about these things. What would I say? Like this uses one ethical theory. You would need to use more than one ethical theory and do a compare and contrast sort of kind of thing to reach an answer. An A+ level would use all 3 of the valid ethical theories: utilitarianism, deontological ethics, and virtue ethics, and do an analysis of all 3 and how they would answer the question. In this case, I think actually you can answer the question using all 3 with the same sort of results, which is interesting, which is one of the reasons that for the first one I did this. But it's up to you to sort of come up with those ideas and flesh them out and demonstrate that you have mastered a certain level of theoretical knowledge that you can then apply to concrete factual situations. So that'll be next week. I'll remind you with an email on D2L. So corporate social responsibility. The classical model of corporate social responsibility is rooted in the free market theory. And Milton Friedman was a huge proponent of this classical economic theory. And what does classical or neoclassical free market theory say? Well, it's first of all grounded in the idea of property rights. And this is something that is enormously important in the United States. It's one of those things that is far more part of our culture than it is in the culture of other places. And I think part of the explanation for that has to do with the fact that we have had a large land mass and a relatively small population for most of our history. So when we became the United States, there was all of this land, and as we got more and more crowded, we just sort of moved eastward, right? And we either bought or fought for the land in, North America, in sort of the middle part of the continent between Mexico and Canada. We, acquired land from Mexico. That would be Texas and New Mexico and Arizona and California. And so we just kept moving westward as things got more and more crowded. And people have the ability in this country, more so than in other countries, to own their own property, and is an enormously important aspect of our socio-political culture in the United States. I didn't start out as a marketing professor. I think I've mentioned this several times. I started out as a political science professor, and I used to teach American national government. And it was a big deal at the time when I was teaching American national government. They wanted to have a writing component to every class. And the way that they did that in the liberal arts and the College of Liberal Arts was they wanted you to have a term paper. And I thought, well, that's not terribly useful for people in political science. What is useful is to focus on maybe a socio-political phenomenon that we have in the United States that is somewhat unique to the United States, and that's called the American dream. And I've mentioned this before in here. I was a foreign exchange student in Germany, in West Germany. There were two Germanys when I was a foreign exchange student. There was the West and the East. We had divided the state of Germany into a West side and East side after World War II. And the eastern part of the country was a satellite of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR, which is now Russia. And as a result of World War II and that division of the country, Germany had a different sort of political culture than the United States. And one of the things that was very different about that was that they don't have, you didn't hear anybody running around Germany saying, my German dream is. This is a uniquely American phenomenon, this idea of the American dream. Now, other countries have this idea of manifest destiny that is oftentimes projected and kind of similar, but it's not exactly the same. I think the American dream is one of these cultural phenomenons that impacts politics and our culture in ways that is very unique. And there are economists who have studied this. Stephen Levitt has done an entire series on why America is different and how we're different in his Freakonomics podcast. And so what is the American dream? Well, the American dream largely is the idea that everybody wants to own their own home. Again, in Germany, most of the people that I knew, and they were solidly middle class, didn't own a home because it's a small country. They have a big population. There's not a lot of land. And so it was not usual for most people. And if they did own a home, the family that I lived with owned a home, but it's not like a home in America. It was this whole row of houses. It was a row house, and they had a tiny little yard in the back of this house. It went up 4 stories. It was only really like 1 or 2 rooms wide on each story of the house. So it had a basement where they had a laundry, and that went out to a garden. And then the first floor was a living room and a kitchen, and it was only 1 room wide. You walked in to the house, there was a tiny little hallway, and there was a living room to the left, and the kitchen and kind of dining area was straight ahead. And then there was a staircase that went up to the 2nd floor, and that floor had the parents' bedroom. The 3rd floor had the 2 children that I lived with, that were the siblings of the family that I lived with. They had a bedroom each and a tiny little half bath on the third floor, and then the fourth floor was an attic. And the father had inherited this house from his parents. It was over 100 years old, and they considered that a new house. And when he passed away at some point, I think they've passed away since then, one of the kids would inherit it. It would probably be the male child, and Philip and his sister would be expected to marry and go off with her husband, right? I mean, very different from the United States, where everybody wants to own their own home. Homes are generally on lots that are fairly large compared to most of Western Europe. You have a yard and all of these other things. And that's sort of the American dream, right? To own property. And the reason that this is important in terms of marketing and CSR is because this idea of property rights is enormously influential in American political culture and thinking, and has influenced business. So it's grounded in a laissez-faire approach to property rights. Once you buy something, once you own the property, you can do with it, in theory, whatever you want. Now, that's a gross sort of simplification, because in most cities where people live now, we have zoning, which prohibits you from doing everything that you want with your property. But in theory, when you buy a piece of land, you own all the way to the center of the earth and all the way to the heavens, and you can do with it what you want. Now, if you live in a city, again, you have zoning, and that's the reason a lot of people move out of cities. I have friends that have moved out of Guthrie because they don't want to be subject to the zoning regulations. They want to be able to build what they want to be able to build and have, chickens and hogs and things like that on their property that you can't have in a city limits. But in theory, when you buy property, you can do with it as you choose. Now, the reality is, even in the United States, probably when you buy your home, the mineral rights have probably been severed and sold off to somebody else. And so you don't actually own to the center of the earth anymore. But in theory, you have this little bundle of rights, which we call incorporeal hereditament, and you can give away parts of those rights, and you do, so that you can get things like utilities and stuff like that. But again, this idea of owning this land and being able to control it and do what you want is very, very much a part of the United States system. And we've also been more interested in encouraging business, and the ownership of rights with business entities has been very, very strong, much stronger in the United States than it probably is in other countries where they really, really regulate and limit business. One of the ways that they regulate and limit business, for example, in other countries, is you cannot engage in direct consumer advertising of pharmaceutical products in any other nation on earth except New Zealand. The United States and New Zealand are the only ones. And why do we think that you should be able to do this? Well, again, because if you have something to sell, that's your property, personal property, and you have the right to advertise it and get people to buy it. Now, this leads to some interesting results in the United States from a corporate social responsibility standpoint. When we think about the advertising of pharmaceutical products to people, there are good things and bad things that have come out of that. One of the bad things I think that's come out of this, this adherence to the idea of, this is my property, I can sell it if I want, it's personal property, it's chattel property, and I can advertise it, is that we have become far more aware as patients in this country of products that may be a benefit to us. And so we have a tendency, more so in this country than in other countries, to go to doctors and ask them about, I saw this drug on television, do you think this would help me? And I think that has had some positive impacts in terms of mental health awareness in this country. It's also got some negative impacts, in my opinion, that we have to think about. And it's one of the reasons that they don't allow for this kind of advertising in other countries, in terms of things like people just running to their doctor and wanting something, even though maybe we shouldn't think that there's a pill that will solve every problem. We see this again with regard to things like Ozempic. It was manufactured and developed for treatment of diabetes, and now you've got all these people that are running out and they want to go to their doctor and they're getting semaglutide because it happens to work for weight loss. And so there's a kind of a culture in the United States, and this belief that we can solve everything with a problem. And this is part of the things that we have as problems with this really heavy emphasis on the free market and the neoclassical economic theory, is this laissez-faire approach can oftentimes lead to market failures and externalities that we didn't think about or anticipate when we started, right? We generally think that the free market will take care of things. It will put property to the most efficient use. So if I want a piece of property, why is property in Edmond more valuable than property in Guthrie? Well, it's closer to Oklahoma City. It's a bedroom community of Oklahoma City. You don't have to commute as far. If you work in Oklahoma City, than you do from Guthrie, right? For Edmond. There's a variety of things. So the idea is that the people who want the land and value the house the most are going to put it to the highest and best use, right? And that works a lot of the times when we're talking about private goods. But when we think about things like public goods, we start to run into some problems with the classical absolute free market system. What are some of the problems, for example, that we might have with running into allowing people to basically self-prescribe and run to their doctors and think that everything can be solved with a little pill? Can you think of anything that impacts this? This would seem
that gets rid of like one of the doctor's main like purposes. That's their job, is to figure out the best way to help you, whether it be through medication or through rehabilitation. But if you're being able to just prescribe it yourself, then they're really there to just sign a paper.
Okay, I think that's a good start. Grab a duck. What you're saying is that we generally think people have an expertise in this area, and we should rely on that. And that's what other countries think, right? That doctors have an expertise, and you should rely on that expertise. And if you're not relying on that expertise, well, you might have some problems. Yeah.
A lot of people misuse it, so like that can lead to addiction and like, you know, selling it to other people and contaminating, or like some people that don't need the prescription to fall into that addiction. Because most of the medication is like prescribed, so it's kind of like, what's the word?
Regulated?
Yeah, so they kind of like, the doctors do that so they know what they give you, how much they give you. By the time you come back, they're gonna give you more because they know it's the time. But if you prescribe it yourself, then you can get it whenever, and you can take more than you need to a day.
Yeah, so I think that is one of the things that we have seen, and you're highlighting what we call a market failure here in this, in that if we think that people can just go to the doctor and say, look, I saw this pill on television and I want this pill. And this happened with the opioid crisis, right? They manufactured these drugs that were intended for pain management. And the idea was that they weren't going to be very addictive and that they had less side effects than some of the other things that we were prescribing. And a lot of people got addicted to them. They were going from doctor to doctor to get more and more prescriptions. As you took the drug, you needed more and more, in many instances, of Oxycontin in order to maintain the same sort of level. And we have a whole lot of people that are now addicted, and a black market that has popped up with regard to this. That's a market failure. Basically, it's an externality that we didn't think about at the time. Yeah, it has recognized this advertising of pharmaceuticals. It's allowed us to recognize that perhaps these things are normal parts of human existence, and we should be able to talk about them, but it has also created a belief that, again, we can solve all problems with a pill, and some of those problems that we've solved have created problems that are greater. We have an opioid addiction problem in this country as a result of this sort of laissez-faire attitude, I think, in many respects, with regard to the direct consumer advertising of pharmaceutical drugs, right? What are some other things that we could have problems with in terms of this over reliance on property rights? Well, drugs are personal property, right? I mean, if they're legal and you can get them, you can buy them, you can go to the pharmacy and get them. What about real property? Well, if I bring something onto my property that's dangerous, it could impact not just me, and maybe I'm willing to accept the danger, but people around me. If I start manufacturing something on my property, and we see this, for example, in Western Oklahoma. If you go out to Western Oklahoma, there are more hogs in Western Oklahoma than there are people, because we have large corporate hog farms that have been developed. What do hogs produce a lot of? Huh?
Bile.
They produce a lot of waste. And what are you going to do when you have a large concentration of animals being raised in these sort of corporate environments that are producing all of this waste? Well, it's having real damage to environmental, and we're not just talking about, I mean, there's a lot of controversy with regard to anthropomorphic global warming, right? And there's a lot of people who dispute whether or not we have anthropomorphic global warming as a result of carbon emissions. And that may or may not be true. I will tell you the evidence suggests overwhelmingly that we have anthropomorphic global warming, right? And I've got a friend who works for the Weather Service, and he keeps sending me these experts who claim that global warming isn't a problem. And I think I told you all at one point in time, one of the experts, the last one that he sent me, is someone who is a geologist, has a PhD in geology. He's like, he's a scientist. And I'm like, geology is the stuff that goes from the surface down. Climate is the stuff that happens from the surface up. Not the same, right? But even if we discount the environmental concerns of anthropomorphic global climate change, there is no doubt that water and land is being impacted by large-scale corporate farming of things like chickens and pork in order to satisfy our demand for those products. And I don't think that if you sort of are concerned about animal welfare, you can't sort of be concerned about these things. I have attempted to become a vegetarian on multiple occasions, because if you've watched a movie called Food Inc., it's a documentary, it will make you really think about the mass scale production of meat products in this country. Now, my vegetarianism lasts until I get hungry, and that's usually around noon. And then I start looking for a hamburger or something like that to eat. But I mean, there are, even if you discount the impact that corporate cattle farming is having on global climate change, the amount of waste product that is produced at these facilities and the impact on groundwater, for example, is incredible. And that's a resource that is enormously important. We have to have water to drink, and we are polluting large amounts of it as this waste products from corporate chicken, pork, and cattle production facilities are impacting those scarce resources. And so we have to think about what this is doing in terms of the market failures that can occur. And that's one of the criticisms of the classical economic theory. One of the things I used to show in this class that they've taken down is there used to be something that highlighted this phenomenon. It's called the tragedy of the commons. and it was called the bunny game. And what it did was there were two versions of the game. You played the first version in which there are all of these bunnies on a field and you're a bunny merchant. And so your incentive is to grab as many bunnies. So you play against the computer and you're clicking on these bunnies so that you can get them and sell them as fast as you can. And what happens at the end of the first round? Well, there's no bunnies left, right? So in the second round, they put the bunnies in pens, and you can only grab the bunnies from your pens. And if you get all of the bunnies and sell all of the bunnies in the second part of, or the first part of the second round, you have no bunnies to sell in the second part of, or the second part of the second round, the next round, and so you lose the game. Whereas if you save some of your bunnies, the bunnies reproduce, and then you have bunnies to sell in the third round, right? And so in theory, you're better off. The problem, and what this highlights, is that with regard to things that are not easily, so that's a private good. Bunnies are private goods that in the game that you can sell. If they're public goods, if they're all out on the common, we will overuse the good and damage it. Now, this clinging to an absolute insistence on property rights works well if you're talking about something that is a private good, like the ducks in my basket, right? These ducks are mine. I can use them how I want. By the way, they're not terribly good rubber duckies. If you put them in a bathtub, they don't stay upright. They don't actually float very well. So, but I can use the ducks and I can control the ducks how I want. And I found out, by the way, this is kind of interesting. How many of you know this? There's a duck phenomenon that I didn't realize. Do you know what this duck phenomenon is? What is it?
Where you put them on like cars or?
It's not just a car, it's a particular model of car.
Oh, Jeeps.
On Jeeps, yeah. So you put them on your Jeep and then people trade them as they're cruising around with these. So I brought these down and one of my colleagues pointed this out to me. She's like, oh, are you like, do you have a Jeep? And I'm like, no, I use the ducks to keep track of class participation points. So these are like a private good, right? That I can control and I can hand out the ducks and then I get the ducks back. And that works really, really well. And there's no environmental impacts of this. But how do you protect public goods? Water is a public good that we have to protect. And if you have people that are engaging and you have this absolute, so you say, well, you've got this property right. I have this property in Western Oklahoma and I want to put a corporate hog farm there. Well, the runoff from the animal waste is impacting the farm next to me who's growing wheat. And now I am polluting their farm and their wheat is, being destroyed, or it is being contaminated with, dangerous pathogens that is a product of the waste that I'm creating. How do you account for that degradation of the overall public good, which is things like clean water, maintaining soil quality? It's really, really hard because that's something that we can't really sell. We do sell water, right? You have to generally, most of us live in a community and you have to buy water. Although if you live out in the country, you drill a well and you don't pay for water. And there's these ads all over Edmond that have popped up on these billboards for people that are marketing, get free water for irrigation. You can drill a well on your property and you can irrigate, use it for your lawn using groundwater, which comes from the Garber-Wellington aquifer here, but you cannot use it in your home. That's why a lot of people want to move out to the country, because they can drill a well and have free water and not worry about that. But if this water is being polluted by the corporate hog farm next to you, or the corporate chicken farm next to you, or by arsenic levels that are increasing as a result of, various types of use associated with oil and natural gas production and things like that. We have a problem, right? And how do we provide, or how do we account for these externalities that the classical model really doesn't take into account? So the modified version of the classical model proposed by Norman Bowie. First of all, he says we have an obligation to do no harm. Now, this can be hard to do. Do no harm. I mean, we have to have food production in this country. We have a lot of people, and we need food production. Now, how we go about producing that food is another issue. What should we do in terms of food production? Well, you have to make sure, with regard to things like these corporate hog farms, okay, you have the right to put this corporate hog farm, you live out in the country, there's no zoning regulations, but you have to still engage in things that deal with the waste product in a healthy manner, right? So that you're not polluting the groundwater or the rivers and streams of the people below your property in the runoff. So first of all, do no harm. Second, you have a prima facie duty to prevent harm, according to Bowie. And then third, encourage the good. Now, Milton Friedman would be horrified by this. He said that business has, if you do anything other than maximize shareholder wealth, you're basically stealing from the shareholders. If you're doing anything other than maximizing the wealth of the business, you are in effect misusing corporate resources, and that's theft. And so he would say we shouldn't encourage, business has no obligation to do good, according to Friedman. That's just antithetical to this free market system that we have. I told you, I think in a previous lecture, politicians get in trouble when they tell the truth. And so there was a candidate who was running for presidency. His name was Mitt Romney, and he was running against Barack Obama for the presidency. And some reporter asked him a question about corporations and what corporations were doing in impacting certain things. And I don't remember if it was environmental or safety. And Mitt Romney said, "Corporations are people, my friends." And everybody laughed at him. That's true. Corporations are people. Legal people. Now, they're not a flesh and bone person, but they are a legal person. What does that mean? It means that they can own property in their own name. They can sue and be sued in their own name. They stand distinct and separate from their creators. Ford was created by Henry Ford, who's, created the first mass-produced consumable, for large-scale consumption of a middle-class public automobile. Before that, the automobile was a novelty that was owned by very wealthy people. They were highly customizable. They were individually built. He mass produces this thing and changes the way that we go about moving in the modern world. Henry Ford is long since dead. And the company that bears his name is still in existence, right? It is a legal person that has continued in existence. And so everybody laughed at Mitt Romney, but that's true. It is a legal person. And Friedman would say, look, as a legal person, the officers and directors of that company have a duty to ensure the well-being, and that's financial. What is a non, breathing legal person need to survive? Well, it's financial sustainability. And so your duty is to make sure that the corporation, if you are an officer or director of this entity, survives, and that's your only duty. Now, what I would respond to that, and the reason why I think that we should encourage corporations to do good, is that we are giving you as a society, as the sovereign in this country, the sovereign entity is giving you an enormous benefit by conferring on you corporate status. What does corporate status give you? Anybody know? Why do you form a corporation? What's the benefit of forming a corporation? Why do you do this? Why do you form a corporate entity?
Something to do with like liability.
Ah, that's exactly right. So that you can limit liability. It allows for the large scale pooling of capital. So when we think about business entities, when you want to start a business, there are a number of ways that you can go about doing this, right? What's the simplest form of business that you can have? It's called a DBA, right? Doing business as. What's an example of a DBA? I'm a lawyer, and when we talk about the formation of corporations, we have to distinguish between the ease with which you can start an entity and the substantive law that may govern the entity's activities, right? And what do I mean by this? So what's a business that I could start without anything, that I could just, go ahead and put myself out there and run without notifying any government entity, without filing any paperwork? Well, I could start a law practice. And I have a law practice, right? Now, turns out that I have filed paperwork to have that law practice be a limited partnership, which is a formation of a business entity. But I could start out, I could end that law practice and I could go out on my own. I had a partner, he's since passed away. But we started this law firm, but we could have just each hung out a shingle and started a law practice. And I know lots of people who do that. When I was a young lawyer, there was a lawyer down in Oklahoma County who he had a private practice. He didn't have a LLC, a limited liability corporation, or anything like that. His telephone was the payphone on the wall next to the shoe shine booth at the Oklahoma County Courthouse. And on his cards that he had printed, it gave the number of that telephone, that payphone. You all have you ever seen a payphone? One person has seen, like,
Use it one time.
you got to use a payphone. Okay. There used to be these things all over before we all had this device that we're constantly, addicted to the point that there is a physiological phenomenon that has happened as a result of all of us having this device. We have phantom vibrations. How many of you feel like phantom I feel them all the time. Like, I will not even have the phone on me. It'll be over here on the thing and I'll feel some vibration. And I'll think, okay, gotta answer that phone.
There's another interesting thing that I learned recently too about different generations and how they use like hand gestures for things. So older generations, when they say call, they'll do how the phones used to be
Right.
shaped like
a receiver.
The younger generations now will do this.
I can believe that.
They will just put their
Because
hand
you
over
don't-
your ear.
Like, you don't you've never seen like a phone where you've seen a phone with a receiver and a,
So I
and
thought
a
that was
handle.
interesting.
That is interesting. So we have these devices that we're all addicted to. This guy, his phone was the pay phone next to the shoe shine, and he would sit there at the shoe shine stand, get his shoes shined, and then go to court. And he mostly did DUI cases. So he would give his clients who are DUI, citation holders. He would give them his card. It would be this payphone at the Oklahoma County Courthouse. He didn't have a company or anything like that. He was just operating on his own. Now, in order to do that, you have to be a licensed attorney, right? So again, you have to distinguish between the ease with which you can start the business, which a DBA just requires that I start a business. And I can do this as a lawyer. That's different than the substantive law, which regulates the practice of law, which says that in order to start that kind of business, you have to have gone to law school. It has to be an ABA accredited law school, and it has to, have certain classes, and then you have to pass the bar, right? But you can start a business that doesn't require any regulation. One of my students early on started a business. He didn't have a corporation form. There's very little regulation of it. He had a lawn mowing business here in Edmond. His dad, he started out by, he wanted a truck, and so he started out by just mowing the neighbors' yards in his neighborhood that he could walk to with his push mower here in Edmond. And he saved up enough money to buy more equipment and to buy a truck, and then he started this business, right? That's completely unregulated. You don't have to, there's no certification process to mow yards. You can start with a mower and a weed eater and go to town, and if people will hire you, you can start a business, and you don't need anything else. You don't need a license from the state. You don't need to let the state know that you're in business. You have to pay taxes, of course, on that. That's income, but you can start it, and it's a DBA. Now, what's the disadvantage? The advantage is anyone can do this. You can start selling ducks if this is, to people who have Jeeps. You could import various ducks. The reason we started getting these ducks was my mother was going through cancer treatments, and my friend and I would go walk the mall while she was getting cancer treatments. And there was this duck hunt machine that said it guaranteed that you would win. If you put in $1, you were guaranteed a duck. And we were bored walking the mall after we'd finished walking the mall, so we'd go play this stupid duck game. And then the challenge came because you were guaranteed to win a duck, right? You could play it over and over and over again until you got a duck. The challenge came to get the duck that you wanted from the machine, to pick out, to say, I'm going to get that duck, and then go and get that duck. And a lot of times you'd end up with some other duck because the claw would grab the one next to it or something like that, right? So you could start a business where you're selling these ducks to people who have Jeep, is it Wranglers? Is that right? Jeep Wranglers, and you're selling these ducks. They're not regulated. You don't need a license to sell these stupid ducks, right? And you could sell them to people. You could go out and as you're driving around, you have your Jeep Wrangler, loads and loads and loads of ducks, and sell them to other people that are doing this. I guess this is a trade thing, is what I'm told. With people, if they put them on their Jeep Wrangler on the dashboard, is that right? And then if you see somebody else who has a Wrangler, you trade ducks with them. I don't know. So anyway, start this business, DBA. What's the disadvantage of this? Easy to start. The disadvantage is that, let's suppose it turns out that these ducks that you're running around in your Jeep Wrangler, you have all of these different ducks. You have very exotic ducks. In the pile here, this is a chicken duck. This is a college graduate duck, right? This is the Statue of Liberty duck. This is a kitty duck. So you have all these different ducks. Let's suppose that it turns out that these ducks are toxic. I'm going to guess that they're made not in the United States, right? Let's see if it even tells us where they're made. Where do you think they're made? China. Yeah, the ducks are made in China. China is notorious for manufacturing toys that have things like lead-based paint, right? So let's suppose that it turns out that the duck is toxic because the little paint that they've got on the duck turns out to have some kind of chemical in it that is toxic. And somebody gets sick. Their child in the Wrangler that you sold it to somebody, starts chewing on, because kids chew on stuff, chewing on the duck, and they get sick. And they come back and they say, well, you sold me this duck and my kid got sick. And the doctor says, beyond a doubt, this is what caused it. He was perfectly healthy before, starts chewing in the duck, and the child gets sick, and you now owe me, right? The disadvantage of this form of entity is that you have unlimited liability, which means that when the person who sues you for the toxic duck, if you have assets, they're going to be able to seize those assets from you. Let's suppose you have $1 million in a savings account and this child gets sick. What's going to happen to your $1 million in the savings account? Anybody been to a hospital lately? It's expensive to go. When I was in the PhD program, I had a motorcycle, and I rode the motorcycle because they didn't give graduate students at New Mexico State. Graduate students were expected to teach, so we were faculty, but we weren't given the privileges of faculty. We didn't have faculty parking, and the parking at New Mexico State meant that if you were a student, you parked up. Basically, if you didn't get there really early in the morning, you had to park up at the Pan Am Center, which was way up the hill, and then walk to class. Well, if you're an instructor and you're teaching, that can present a problem, right? Having to park up at the Pan Am Center, which was about 3/4 of a mile from the College of Business where I taught, was problematic. And most universities, by the way, give graduate assistants, graduate teaching assistants, faculty parking for that very reason, because faculty members need to be on class on time, right? Because the class doesn't start unless I'm here. And so but New Mexico State didn't. So there was an interesting anomaly in their parking, which was you had to have even if you rode a motorcycle, you had to have a parking permit, just like you had to have a parking permit for your car. But motorcycle parking was unregulated in terms of where you could park. You could park your motorcycle in a faculty lot with any parking permit. And there was motorcycle parking in all of the lots, including the faculty lot right in front of the College Business, right? So I would ride my motorcycle. It's Las Cruces, New Mexico. The weather in the winter is generally very nice. It's like most days are like this in Las Cruces. My mother would call when I was a graduate assistant down there, and she'd be like, and it would be horrible here. It'd be snowing and cold. And she'd be like, what's the weather like down there? I'm like, it's 75 degrees. It's on the border of Mexico. It was 75 degrees. So I would ride my motorcycle every day to work. One morning, this woman pulls out right in front. She's looking at me. It's incredible. She's looking at me and she pulls out right in front of me, and I laid my motorcycle over, right? And of course, when you do that, what happens? Well, luckily nothing was broken, but I did get, I had to have stitches and things like that because the body armor that I was wearing slipped and it tore up my elbow and things like that. So I went to the hospital. I was in the hospital less than 4 hours getting stitched up. And the bill, if I hadn't had insurance, was over $25,000 for that experience. Not overnight, just in the ER, right? Getting stitched up, x-rays, they wanted to x-ray, they did, CT on my head, all of this stuff, because they're afraid that, you bumped your head and you might have a concussion. So it was incredible, right? So if you have these kinds of medical bills for this child that you've sold the duck to his mother, and you have $1 million in your bank account, that $1 million is probably gonna go away. Because you have a DBA and you have unlimited liability. So what can you do? What's the next kind of business that you could form that's also very simple, but a little more complex? You could have a partnership, right? This has the advantages of the DBA, but now you can have, so I had a partner for many years in my law practice. And the advantage of doing that was I was really good at things like intellectual property. He was really good at contracts. So we combined our skills and we could expand the scope of our practice. Two minds are better than one. But again, still have unlimited liability with this form of business entity, which meant that if we did something to harm someone, not only am I liable for myself, I'm also liable for my partner's mistakes and omissions, right? And you can do a lot of damage as an attorney. So again, you have unlimited liability. So advantage, ease, disadvantage. So the advantage of this type is advantage, disadvantage is easy to form, unlimited liability. So then what's the next form that you can have? You can have the corporate form. Now, the advantage of this is limited liability. The disadvantage is you have formalities. Because it's a legal person, you have to meet the formalities. What does that mean? Well, you have to file with the Secretary of State articles of incorporation. Now, it's gotten a lot easier. These formalities are really not all that burdensome because we've come up with other forms. Under the traditional form, you had to have, bylaws and all of these things. You had to have stockholder meetings. You had to have, those had to have minutes. So you had to have a secretary. You had to have a corporate seal. When I was a young attorney, you would go down to Walker Stamp and Seal, and you'd form your corporation, and that you would have to go down and you'd actually have to have this thing made, which was like a stamp that would emboss paper with the corporate seal, and all corporate documents had to be sealed, contracts had to be sealed. Now that's a stamp that you can get, and I don't even think you have to have a stamp anymore for it. You can just have an officer sign for it. So there were these formalities that you had to have. We've simplified those, and now you can basically just file a thing. And basically what you do is you're basically putting people on notice that you have limited liability, and you are limited in the liability to the amount of investment in that corporate entity. Now, why is all of this important with regard to a critical assessment of Milton Friedman's position on corporate social responsibility is nothing more than to make profit? You have now given something to these people that is enormously valuable. This limited liability, by allowing them to basically say to people, hey, look, I have limited liability. You cannot come after me personally for anything that happens. You've given them an enormous advantage. What is that enormous advantage? The ability to pool capital, right? No one would invest in Ford if they had unlimited liability. What's one of the things that Ford got famous for in the past that was a big corporate social responsibility failure? They manufactured a car, most of you have never heard of this, called the Ford Pinto. Anybody heard of a Ford Pinto? Nobody's heard of the Ford Pinto. It was a really ugly car. This is the classic Ford Pinto. And in fact, that was a classic color, brown. And what Ford wanted was they wanted to manufacture a car that was really, really cheap. This is sort of the history, like Ford Motor Company starts, their first car that they manufacture is the Model T, and it is a car for everybody. Well, they continued on with this, and the Ford Pinto was really, really cheap. Now, in order to keep things really, really cheap on this car, they put the gas tank in the back where gas tanks are in a lot of cars. But it was cheaply made, and it turns out that if you got rear-ended, the bumper and the supports would go into the gas tank. Usually when metal on metal occurs, you get a spark. And what happens? If you have spark combined with gas, you have explosion, right? And so the Ford Pinto would blow up. Now, if I were a shareholder and I were subject to being sued and I could lose all of my money, I wouldn't invest in Ford. Nobody would, right? So by having limited liability, if Ford were to go broke in the bankruptcy, and it turns out that with regard to this product that Ford manufactured, they knew that it was going to do this. But the average purchaser of a Pinto was not a wealthy individual, and so they had sort of done the calculus that they could pay these people off fairly cheaply. Because the value of that life was not very much. Under the Milton Friedman classical model of that's perfectly acceptable. You do the calculus, you figure out, like, we're going to make more money selling this product because people need a cheap car, right? More than they need to be risk adverse. If we think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Like, if you are starving to death, you're going to be more risky with regard to your safety than if you have lots of access to resources. And so what ended up happening was Ford knew about this. They knew that there was going to probably be a problem. They had done the actuarial studies, and they figured it was just cheaper to pay people off than it was to fix the car and do it correctly at that point in time. So you have given these people, the corporation, because it's a legal entity with limited liability, a huge advantage in that you can now pool. If I'm going to be exposed to unlimited liability for my investment, let's suppose I have $100 to invest in Ford stock and I buy Ford stock. And if I'm exposed to 100% liability for that, I'm not going to invest $100 in Ford, which means that you're never going to have big corporations like Ford out there mass producing goods that we all think are necessary to a postmodern world. If we give you that kind of advantage, shouldn't society be able to say, we have some expectation that you will engage in the good? And I think we can. And what I think we also find with regard to this is that encouraging the good turns out to be fairly good business, right? People want to do business. Your generation particularly wants to do business. Why is it that your generation says that they're willing to pay and have expressed this? They're willing to pay more for certain types of products, the one for one that Tom's does or Bombas. You can get really cheap socks, right? A lot of you probably have bought Bombas. A lot of my friends buy Bombas socks. They're more expensive. Are they a good sock? Yeah, they're okay. I have quite a few pairs of Bombas. I didn't buy them. My brother and my friends, they're like, because they know I teach ethics. They're like, we bought you an ethically sourced product for Christmas. I'm like, yeah, I'll buy socks at Walmart. You know, but I mean, are they a good product? Yeah, they're a good product. That whole, you know, we've done away with the annoying toe seam. No, not really. It's just they've moved the toe seam up on the foot. I can still feel it. If you have sensory integration disorder or sensory processing disorder, which I do, you can still feel it. If you're hypersensitive, you can still feel it. But it's a good sock, right? I mean, they're good, and people want to buy them. Those companies are successful because they are engaging in the good. They are engaging in the good. Well, how do we do that? Well, a lot of it is by using a stakeholder theory. What does the stakeholder theory say? Every decision affects a wide range of people. And so when you think about these cases, for your essay, for example, you have to think about not just the immediate people, and this is again where an A answer would come into effect, is thinking about the stakeholder theory and the wide range of people that you're going to impact through your business decisions, not just the people involved. So for example, if you have somebody who experiences a loss as a result of a business product or practice, that's not just going to affect them. If a business manages to kill me, it's probably just going to affect me. I don't have any children and I'm divorced. So it's just me. Nobody is dependent upon my income except me, right? So you're pretty lucky if a business happens to kill me, but most people have other people, right? And those business decisions not only affect the parties involved to the transaction, but it affects other people. It affects even suppliers of that business. If the business goes under, you're not only impacting the people that are dependent upon the services of that business, but the suppliers of that business, right? That's what a stakeholder theory looks at. Every decision impacts a wide variety of people, including suppliers of the business, employees of the business, officers of the business, customers of the business, and society at whole. When GM left Oklahoma City, when they closed the plant here because it was no longer profitable, that decision impacted an enormous amount of the Oklahoma City economy. A lot of people worked at that plant and were dependent upon that plant. And their children were dependent upon that plant, right? So it affects this wide range of people. Stakeholder theory rejects the position of privilege of stockholders. Stockholders are a consideration in the equation, but they're not the only consideration. All stakeholder claims have to be balanced among competing claims. So you have to do sort of a calculus. This is a utilitarian, in many respects, viewpoint. This is not to say that there aren't criticisms of stakeholder theory. One criticism, and I think this is a fair criticism, and this is one of the fair criticisms of utilitarianism in general, is how do you balance competing rights? How do you balance that? What do you do when you have competing rights? Whose right is more important than others? And stakeholder theory doesn't provide us with a clear answer to that. Utilitarianism does. You're going to have to balance it among what is the highest and best overall happiness that can be created from a transaction, right? And the second is that it provides little practical advice. I think this criticism is less valid than the other in that practical advice is, in many respects, utilitarian. It is producing, overall greatest happiness. Now that can be really hard to calculate, but not impossible. Are there any questions about stakeholder theory? All right, so I will send out an email next week. You will have, since we're behind because of the snow day, You'll have class period to work on your essays for this, so we will not meet. If you are upset by that, you give me a call and I will be happy to talk to you about ethics ad nauseum on the phone or FaceTime with you or Zoom with you or whatever. You need. All right, if you got ducks, here's your points.
It's like.